normally, before the pandemic hit, I would go on a national book tour, and I would go each day to usually a bookstore, but sometimes a library or university. And I would give a talk like what I'm going to give tonight, and then I would do a Q&A, and I'm going to do a Q&A with you also, but I'd ask you just to hold the questions to the end. But I love that. My favorite part is the question period, and I have a personal reason for that. I am the first published author I ever met, and I had no writing courses. I did have a C+ in creative writing when I was in college, but other than that, I didn't know what I was doing, and I would have loved to have an opportunity to ask someone, how do you do this stuff? So I do encourage people to ask, questions. I've had a couple of movies made out of books. If you want to ask about movies or publishing, anything you're interested in, I'm interested. And I'll stay and answer all the questions till everyone's done. So don't worry that we'll run out of time. I've got plenty of time. It's only 4. I'm in Portland, Oregon, so it's only 4 o'clock here. When I was doing the national stuff, I did 6 book tours in Europe. I've done all over the United States doing these tours. And what I find personally interesting is whether I'm in Oslo or Ottawa or Oklahoma City, when I do the Q&A, I tend to get the same questions. And the 3 biggies are, you were a criminal defense lawyer for 25 years. How did you become a full-time writer? How did you make that? Why? And how did you make that transition? The second one is, where do your ideas come from? And the third one is, what's your writing process like? Do you use an outline? Do you write with a pencil or a computer? And so after getting these same questions over and over, I decided that I would just cut to the chase. And I'm going to try to answer all of those when I give my talk right now. And then again, as I said, anything I leave out or that you're really interested in, ask me about that after. So when I was in the 7th grade, as a result of an overdose of Perry Mason novels, I decided that I was going to be a criminal defense lawyer who did murder cases when I grew up. And for 25 years, that's what I did. I did 30 homicide cases. I did 12 death penalty cases. I got to argue at the United States Supreme Court. And basically, I did everything that in real life that Perry did in the books. The only difference between me and Perry is that most of my clients weren't innocent. Most of all of Perry's are always innocent, and most of mine were not. But I really love my law practice. And it's the only thing that I was ever interested in. As far as the writing goes, I never in a million years thought I would ever write a book. It was not even on my radar. And the reason is that I'm a voracious reader. I still read 2 to 3 books a week. I love reading. I'm really addicted to it. And I started this when I was in elementary school. And I was in awe of writers. I couldn't imagine that I could ever do this because it seemed like magical. So the way I got into it is sort of weird. I went to college, and then in between college and law school, I did 2 years, served 2 years as a Peace Corps volunteer in Liberia, West Africa. And then I came back from Africa and went to NYU Law School. And the last 2 years there, I worked my way through to pay my tuition by teaching junior high school in the South Bronx, which was at that time the highest crime rate area in New York City. So between teaching full-time and going to law school full-time, the only thing I had time for was eating and breathing. And then a wonderful thing happened my last semester. So to get through in 3 years like the day students, I had summer classes. And by my last summer semester that I needed to graduate, I only had 3 classes. I already had a job waiting for me in Oregon, clerking for the chief judge of the Oregon Court of Appeals. And my wife, Doreen, graduated from NYU. She's a math major, and she graduated. And she got a job as a systems analyst at a company. So since she was working, she had enough money to pay the rent, and I didn't have to work that summer. And that was sort of weird for me because I had always had a job. Every summer since elementary school, I'd had some sort of job, paper routes and all sorts of stuff. And for once, I had a free summer. So I didn't know what to do with myself. And since I only had to get D's in my classes to graduate, I've never been that conscious about grades. I really didn't have to put in a lot of work on my classes. And I decided I was going to use that summer to solve what was for me one of life's great mysteries, which is how do those guys fill up 400 pages with words? And I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but I would open up these books and I say, how did this guy think all this stuff up? So my project for the summer was to write a novel based on my experiences in West Africa, not to get published because I didn't even know how you would do that. I just wanted to see, could I write something more than 25 pages? And that was the most I'd ever written a paper on. So it was just like a fun project. It took me about 2 years to do it. The book turned out to be 187 pages, so I was very proud of myself. I met my quota, more than 25. But when you're a lawyer, you're trained to be very objective about your work. And reading my book objectively and unemotionally, I realized it wasn't very good. So I didn't try to get it published, but I did find that I loved writing. And it was really, really fun to create this three-dimensional world where everything always works out exactly the way you want, unlike real life. So I got sort of hooked on writing, and it became a hobby. But still, I didn't think of myself as someone who would actually get anything published until I was in my 30s. And occasionally I would write a short story, and I actually would submit it to a magazine, but they're always rejected. And by the time I got the short story published, I had a full-time criminal practice and had done some murder cases. And my previous stories were all science fiction. And so I thought, well, they say write what you know. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll write a crime story. And I sent it into Mike Shane Mystery Magazine and forgot about it because months went by and I never heard from him. And then one day I was in my office and I was checking my mail, and there was a stack of letters, and in the middle was a gray envelope with black raised lettering, which I remember to this day, from Mike Shane. And it was a very thin letter, so I assumed it was a rejection, which is the only communication I'd ever had from a magazine. But when I opened it up, the letter said, "Dear Mr. Margolin, we were wondering if you would accept $60 from us to give us the honor of publishing your story." And my immediate reaction was that these guys were really stupid, because if they negotiated with me, I would have paid them twice that to get into print. I mean, I was just, absolutely floored. So the short story was The Girl in the Yellow Bikini. It was published. And what I got out of that was self-confidence, because I had a ton of confidence as a lawyer, but I had no self-confidence that I would ever become a writer. And yet here was a national magazine, and they were paying me to publish my story. So I thought maybe I should try to write a novel. Now, my writing career has been very bizarre. And the bizarre stuff started when I started working on my first published book, which was eventually called Heartstone. And when I was clerking at for the chief judge on the Oregon Court of Appeals, I came across the Peyton Allen murders. Now, the Peyton Allen murders occurred in the late 50s and early 60s in Oregon. And in my own personal opinion, like I said, I've done 30 homicides. I've read some of the famous true crime novels like Helter Skelter. I personally don't think there's a more bizarre and incredible murder case in American history than the Peyton Allen murders. And the case was actually in the courts for 20 years, and it had everything and the kitchen sink. It was had sex slaves and gangs and bizarre forensic evidence. And I had this little nugget all to myself because in the 1970s, when I was in Oregon, there weren't a lot of writers, and no one was writing legal thrillers. So this was a little gem that I had for myself. Nowadays, Oregon has a raft of really excellent writers who get nominated for all sorts of national awards. But back then, there was just a handful of people that were writing in Oregon. So I started working, and the way I work now is the way I started out. Because I had a full-time law practice, I had to figure out a very economic way of doing my writing as a hobby. And what I do first is I get an idea. Okay, that's how all my books start. Some germ of an idea pops into my head. Could the president of the United States be a serial killer? That was the idea for the book Executive Privilege. But an idea is small, it's this big, and a book is this big. So you gotta figure out how do you expand that idea. So the first thing I do, and I advise new people who haven't published but who want to write a book, don't write, think. And what I do is once I get my idea, I spend weeks sometimes thinking about the characters and scenes and the plot, and I won't write a single word until I've got the ending, because the ending is the most important part of a book. I'm sure a lot of you have read a book or seen a movie that was fantastic and it had a lousy ending. So what do you tell your friends? You just say, oh, yeah, I just finished this book. It was okay. The ending was pretty bad. You forget that you love 90% of the movie or the book because the ending left a bad taste in your mouth. Flip that over. How many of you have read a book or seen a movie that was okay, but had an amazing ending? What do you tell people? Oh my God, when I found out the butler did it, my jaw dropped. It was amazing. So even though the book wasn't that great for most of it, if the ending's fabulous, you leave with a real sense of satisfaction. So again, I will not write a word. Now with the executive privilege, what I mentioned before, so you know I'm not lying, I got that idea in 1995, could never figure out how to resolve it until 2005. And then it became one of my best sellers and it's one of my most popular books. But I literally waited 10 years to write it because I couldn't figure out how it would end. So once I got the ending, I know who the bad guys are and how they're going to get caught. I then do an outline, and my outlines take 1 to 3 months. And again, I'm not writing, I'm thinking. And I talk myself through the book from beginning to end. And while I'm doing this, I'm spending maybe 6 hours a day just thinking about the plot. And so I'm getting more and more ideas. I'll figure out that I need an extra character or something's not working. Some plot idea I thought was great. Turns out it's not really going to fit together. So working on the outline and just, again, thinking, not writing, really helps you develop your book. Once my outline's done, and they're usually roughly 25 pages long, the book's written. It's just in shorthand. And then what I do is I take each paragraph, I make it into a chapter, and then I finish up with a 400-page outline, because your first draft is usually not very good. But at that point, I've got I've got the book written, it's just not a really publishable quality book. And then I spend months editing for quality. So that now you know everything I know about writing. That's my whole process. And even though I'm doing it full time now, I do the same thing I did when I did my original one with a full-time law practice and raising 2 kids. So again, getting back to how did that book get published? Well, this is where things became really bizarre. I had no idea what you do with a finished manuscript. I didn't know about agents. I didn't know publishers. And out of the blue, after I had 5 chapters written, I got a call from Marty Bauer, who was a friend of mine from law school. We roomed next to each other my first year in law school. And then we both went to night school to try to earn money for tuition. And then by the 3rd year, we drifted apart. I got married. We didn't have classes together. We were both working. And then I moved to Oregon. He stayed in New York. And so I hadn't seen him for maybe 4 or 5 years. And Marty calls up and he says, Phil, he says, I'm going to come, my wife and I want to come to Oregon on vacation. Can we get together? And I said, great. You know, you can stay at the house and I'll take some time off from work and I'll drive you out to the Columbia Gorge and up to Mount Hood. So I drove out to pick him and his wife up at the airport. And when we're driving back, I asked him what you would ask any person you hadn't seen in 4 years. So Marty, what are you doing? And it turned out that Marty was one of 3 lawyers for the largest literary agency in the world. And I told him that I was working on this book, but I had no idea what I was doing because I hadn't any writing classes and I was just sort of hacking around at it. And I said, could you do me a favor? Could you take my 5 chapters back to New York and show them to somebody in the agency and then just have them call up and say, hey, this is terrific, keep going, or it's, you know, really awful, stop doing what you're doing. So Marty took the chapters back to New York and I went back to my law practice and sort of forgot about the fact that I'd given them the chapters because a couple of months went by and I didn't hear from them. And then one afternoon I was in trial and the court recessed around 5 o'clock. I got back to my office around 5:30 and assumed everyone would be gone. But instead, everyone was sitting around with champagne. And I said, what happened? And they said, well, your agent called and they sold your book. And I didn't know I had an agent. And what had happened was Marty liked the chapters. He'd given them to somebody at the agency who had never sold a book before. He was brand new. Marty said, you know, this is my friend wrote this in Oregon, see what you can do with it. Well, this Jed Mattis had been a secretary to an editor at Pocketbooks, and he had decided he'd rather be an agent. So he moved over to this agency, but he got the brainstorm of calling up his old editor, called him up, and the editor loved Ned Levitt, loved the chapters, and I got a book contract. So it was sort of just fell on my head. I really probably, if Marty had said, you know, should I show it to someone, I would have been terrified because it was just really a rough draft. It wasn't even a completed draft. But that's not normally how somebody gets published. And normally you go through years of rejection and a lot of heartbreak, and I'm not sad that I didn't go through that period. And I've always considered myself incredibly lucky that I went to law school and was friendly with someone who worked for this big agency. So at that point, I wrote the book. It was published 1978 and actually got nominated for an Edgar for Best Original Paperback. I then wrote a second book called The Last Innocent Man, which was eventually made into a movie. And then I quit for 12 years. And the reason I quit was that my real passion was criminal defense. And the same year, 1978, when my first book was published, I also got to argue at the US Supreme Court, and my daughter was born, so it was a pretty good trifecta. In between the two books, I started getting hired to do major murder cases and big appeals, all the stuff that I wanted to do as a kid. And so the writing was just a fun hobby, and I put it on the back burner for 12 years. Then in 1993 or 92, actually, at a dinner party, I got an idea for a third book. And it was a conversation that I had with one of the guests. Well, I just thought, oh, this is a pretty neat idea. It'll be fun to have a third book published. I hadn't had one published in 12 years. So I just sat down and I started writing again. And about 6 months later, I had a 500-page manuscript, and I called up my agent. And again, things started getting weird. Jean Nagar was my agent at that time, and her agency still represents me. And I said, you know, I've written a third novel. Would you be willing to take a look at it? And she said, well, yeah, but my son's getting married in Paris. So I'm going to be in Europe up until the end of June. So I can't really see it till July. And I said, well, you know, you waited 12 years for me. I could wait a couple of weeks, you know, for you. So I said, I'll mail it in to you. And then when you get a chance, you know, take a look at it and get back to me. Well, the week before Jean came back from Europe, I started getting letters from around the country, many of them from people that I had communicated with in years. And each letter had a copy of an article from the New York Times business section. And quite frankly, timing, as I mentioned, usually with the pandemic, had lousy timing, but my timing was amazing for this third book. The article basically said, and you've got to, let me back up. Before 1987, there was no such thing as a legal thriller. That genre didn't exist. If you had a book with a lawyer and a murder, it was a murder mystery. The murder mysteries were not reviewed in the New York Times. They didn't get on the bestseller list. They were just sort of fun things that you read on your vacation or something. So in 1987, Scott Turow wrote a terrific book called Presumed Innocent. And Farrar, Straus & Giroux, his publisher, had a problem because it was about a lawyer and a murderer, which would normally make it a murder mystery. But they knew that murder mysteries didn't sell. So they thought, what can we do to make this excellent book more palatable for the reading public? And someone got this idea. They said, well, this is not a murder mystery. It's a legal thriller. It's a book about law written by a lawyer that gives the reader an inside look at how the law works. And sure enough, that marketing ploy worked because the book was on the New York Times list for 2 years, and it created this legal thriller craze. And then in 1989, I believe it is, John Grisham published The Firm. Well, this article in the New York Times business section said that readers were just frothing at the mouth to get hold of legal thrillers, but the publishers had no books. And they'd been getting books by lawyers who wanted to cash in on Turow and Grisham's fame, but most of the books were badly written or boring. But in the article, this is true, it said there was one type of lawyer that every publisher in America would kill his mother to get his hands on. That was a full-time criminal defense lawyer who'd written a novel. And so I'm thinking that God had created a genre that only I fit into. And when Jean came back, I said, did you read that article? And she said, yes. I said, what are you going to do? And she said, I'm going to think. So a couple of months later, but early, I guess it was maybe late July or early August. I was in Central Oregon on vacation with my family, and I decided to call my office to see if I had any emergencies in my law cases. And there was a little note, call your agent. So I called up, I said, what's up? And she said, where will you be August 4th? And I said, probably in my office. I think I've got a brief I've got to work on. And I said, why do you want to know? And she said, well, I'm going to auction your book. And at that point, my eyes rolled back and boom, I was out like a light. To explain that, the normal way that an agent sells a book is to send your manuscript to one editor at one publishing house at a time. And these guys are really busy. So it could take between 2 to 6 months before they read your manuscript. If they like it, they'll make an offer. If they don't, they'll pass. And if they pass, you have to go through this process again. So with a normal book, you might only have 3 or 4 editors in a year taking a look at it, which is really frustrating if you've been spending several years writing the book. If your agent thinks that she has a bestseller on her hands, she will send the manuscript out to everybody in publishing that she thinks might be interested in it and hold an auction. And that's what happened with Gone But Not Forgotten, my first bestseller. And I wish I could say I knew it was going to be this big deal, but I honestly just thought it'd be fun to get a 3rd book published. But the next thing I know, I'm on the bestseller New York Times list for 10 weeks. Book sold well over 1 million copies. It was published in 27 foreign languages, became a movie, and on and on and on and on. Basically, everything you dream about if you're an author happened with that book. So at that point, I decided that I wanted to keep writing, but I didn't know whether I wanted to be a full-time writer because I didn't know if I would be a one-hit wonder. Pardon me. We've got cold weather in Oregon. I think I'm getting a bit of a cold. Anyway, I didn't know whether I'd want to be a one-hit wonder because there are a lot of writers that have one big bestseller and then they, like Margaret Mitchell, Gone with the Wind, or To Kill a Mockingbird, Harper Lee, and then they never publish again. And I didn't know if I'd like to be a full-time writer because I had always just done it as a hobby. So I had about 2 years worth of cases and I stopped taking new cases. And I figured at the end of 2 years, I would know if I was going to be a successful author, if I'd have a successful career, or if I, liked it or didn't like being a full-time writer. And by the time I ran out of cases, I'd had 5 New York Times bestsellers and really liked the writing. So it was swapping after 25 years, one job that I really loved, being a criminal defense lawyer, for another job that I still love, and am now on my 24th book. Yesterday, I emailed the edited draft of the next book in the Robin Lockwood series back to New York, and I'm now 100 pages into the 26th book. So I just love writing and I do it. A little bit about A Matter of Life and Death, which is my new book, and then I'll take questions. One of the most important jobs that I did as a criminal defense lawyer was representing people in murder cases where the defendant can get the death penalty. And doing a death case is completely different from any other type of law case. It's even substantially different from a murder case that doesn't carry the death penalty. And what I decided I would do with A Matter of Life and Death is in the framework of a thriller, because it's not a lecture. This is a murder mystery with a surprise ending and a lot of action and courtroom drama. I decided to show people who are not attorneys or our attorneys who don't do these cases, how a death penalty case works from beginning to end. Now, Robin Lockwood is one of my favorite characters. I've had a couple other series. Amanda Jaffe, who actually makes a cameo appearance in A Matter of Life and Death, and Dana Cutler in my Washington trilogy, which is the book I talked about, Executive Privileges in the White House, Supreme Justices in the U.S. Supreme Court, and Capital Murder is in the U.S. Senate. And then I gave Dana her own book, Sleight of Hand. So I have a couple of series, but this one is really a very enjoyable character. For those who don't know about Robin, Robin grew up in the Midwest in a small farming town. Her older brothers were all champion wrestlers. And so when she got old enough to go to high school, she decided she wanted to be on the wrestling team. But a number of parents objected to having her on the team because she was a girl, and they didn't want their boys wrestling with a girl. So the school board bought into that and banned her from the team, but her father hired a lawyer, and they sued the school board and won, and she was allowed to be a wrestler on the team, and that inspired her to be a lawyer. So she always decided from that point on she was going to be a lawyer after she graduated college. And she actually became the first girl to place in the boys tournament. She finished third place in her district in her senior year. When she went to college, she went to a state university with a Division I wrestling team and realized there's no way in the world she was ever going to be getting on that team. But there was a gym nearby where they did mixed martial arts. And she started practicing and got good enough to become a professional fighter. And eventually, by the time she finished college, she was ranked nationally in the top 10. And Robin is very, very smart. So she went to Yale Law School, which is one of the toughest law schools in the country to get into. But she continued her fighting career and was on national television on pay-per-view events out of Las Vegas while she was a law student. But in her first year, she was knocked unconscious in one of her in a bout with the number 2 ranked contender, and had short-term memory loss and a concussion, and decided to give up the professional fighting to concentrate on law school. So that's her background. So she's a brilliant lawyer, but she also is a fighter. And the reason I did that was because I have a lot of very strong women characters in my books, and they do occasionally get into dangerous situations. In real life, if a woman fights a man, probably they're going to lose because men are just have more muscle and they're bigger. So I was trying to think, how could I make it more realistic in my books if Robin gets in a situation where she has to defend herself? How could I make it realistic if she won the fight? And they say, oh, of course, I'll make her a professional fighter. And so that's what I did. In A Matter of Life and Death, Robin represents Joe Lattimore. Now, Joe Lattimore is a homeless man. He's a short order cook and so-so professional fighter, hadn't fought in a while. And he loses his job, he can't get another job, and he loves his wife. He's married and he has a little baby who he loves, and he has no money. And they're living in a tent city in Portland, when a guy comes up to him and says, how would you like to earn $300? And that's a huge amount of money for him because it would enable him to get the family out of the tent city and into a motel for a while he looks for work. And but the problem is that to earn the money, he's got to be in an illegal, no holds barred fight that's held out in the countryside in a barn. And in the fight, he kills his opponent, not intentionally, but it's in the heat of that action. And the people that run the fight have a video of this fight, and they threaten to blackmail him and show the police that he killed this guy if he doesn't burglarize a house. Well, he has no choice, so he's driven up into a very wealthy section of Portland, and he thinks he's breaking into the house to steal something from a safe. But when he gets into the house, he finds the dead body of the wife of a very prominent judge. And the next thing you know, he's been arrested for this murder. His fingerprints are all over the living room where the corpse is found. There are eyewitnesses who see him running out of the house. And it looks like there's no way in the world that Robin can win this case. And if you want to find out how she does, you're going to have to read the book. There's a lot of action in the book. And there is a surprise ending with a murder and a clue. And if you can figure out, if you spot the clue, you'll be able to figure out who done it. But I'm not going to tell you what the clue is. So that's my talk. And now